This is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Brian McCormick, head basketball coach at Broward College in Florida. Hi everyone, welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Brian McCormick. Brian is a professional basketball coach who has coached and run clinics all around the world. He received his PhD in exercise and sports science from the University of Utah in 2013. He has also written several books on topics related to talent development and practice design in basketball, which you can find at learntocoachbasketball.com. In the interview, we discussed topics including current problems with the way we identify and develop talent, coaching fake fundamentals, and designing practice to increase game intelligence and awareness. Hope you enjoy!
Not 10 years ago, I was a child. I was a good boy and you let me go. Now I'm on a talk show.
Today my guest is Brian McCormick, professional basketball coach and author of several books related to talent development and practice design. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Brian.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm honored.
And to start off with, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
I played sports growing up. I probably knew or intended to be a coach basically as long as I can remember. I think like in second or third grade, read They Call Me Coach by John Wooden as my, for like a school book report type thing. And, I just kind of, from then on, I wanted to be a coach. My dad coached me in almost every sport that I played, when I was really young, all the way up until I reached high school. And so, I always imagined, that I would coach in some capacity. Back then, I think I probably imagined that I would be like my dad and have a regular job and then just coach my own kids or something like that. Then as I moved into college, I thought maybe, I'd coach, be a teacher and coach high school basketball or something like that. And then I just, I kept applying for and getting different jobs and moved on. And, so I've coached at, most levels, over the last, almost 20 years now, different countries, doing clinics and so forth. And so that's most of what I do is coaching or coaching related. My books are all, for the most part, coaching related. I got my undergraduate degree in literature, American literature, which is part of the reason for all of the writing that I do, I suppose. And then eventually I went back to school and I got my PhD in exercise and sports science at the University of Utah and studied things related to basketball, plyometric training, and defensive movement for basketball. And so that was kind of the intention, back in the late aughts. I used to get in arguments with basketball coaches about the way that we should teach different things. And all we had to go on was kind of, everybody's opinion. So, well, this coach does this, but this coach does this. Or, if you watch players in slow motion, they do this, but they're being taught this. But nobody really had researched any of these things. And so that was one of the things that kind of prompted me to look into actually going back and getting a PhD and doing some research is to answer some of the questions that I had and some of the arguments that I had, with coaches about the different ways that we teach things. And so, I did that and then I coached for a couple more years and now I'm the head coach at a junior college in Florida, coaching a women's team. Continuing to write and looking at other different ways to affect coaching and player development and so forth within basketball.
Yeah, that's really great. I was going to ask you about when kind of the PhD fit into things, but that's really cool that you kind of were motivated to answer some questions you had and instead of waiting around for other people to do it. That's really admirable.
So that's how I ended up at University of Utah. I more or less said that I wanted to do my own thing and to his credit, Dr. Hannon kind of let me do what I wanted to do. I wasn't kind of forced into, more of a rigid program or doing somebody else's research. I kind of was afforded the opportunity to do what I wanted.
Let's dive into the specific topic, kind of the broad topic of talent ID and development. And I wanted to start off with, I know you have some thoughts on this, about what are the current problems with the way we're doing these things?
I think probably the two biggest problems is, one is we still haven't defined what talent is. And so I think that begins the problem, is when we're talking about talent, what are we talking about? Is it just, kind of when we see somebody who's good, or are we confusing talent with skills? Are we combining it with abilities? Generally when people speak, in layman's terms about talent, it can be any of the above. So somebody who is rather tall in basketball may be talented, or somebody who's fast, or somebody who jumps high, they're talented. But is that really talent, or is that more, some kind of ability? If somebody's a good shooter, does that mean they're talented, or are they just skilled at one specific skill? So I think not having clear definitions is one issue. And I think beyond just not the clear definitions necessarily within research, but more broadly speaking, in terms of the wider space in which we talk about talent and talent development and so forth. The way that you hear it talked about on television differs than the way that a researcher might speak about it, might be different than the way that a coach understands it, or that a parent views it. And because everybody kind of has these, differing viewpoints on what talent actually is, we're all kind of talking past each other. Can't have a true good conversation because we're not even talking about the same things in a lot of respects. The second, and probably the more important problem that we have, is just this insatiable desire to identify talent at the earliest possible ages. And this misconception, I would say, been fed by marketing and media hype and so forth, that, if you're not already picked as an all-star when you're 8 years old, or if you're not on a select team when you're 6 years old, or whatever, that you're not good enough. And so I think that's what really becomes a problem, because that affects then pretty much everything that goes on within youth sports, is that desire to be identified, or that desire to identify, really shapes the whole landscape and the whole youth sport environment, and often creates negative experiences. The dropout in sport, a lot of these issues to me are all, reflect back or are caused by this, desire to say, well, I noticed that this player I said they were going to be a pro when they were 7 years old, and by God they are. So I'm a genius, or the parent who searches for the team to make sure that their, son or daughter is on the all-star team at 7 or 8 years old. My friend was coaching in a local rec league in Los Angeles. I think his son was maybe 8 at the time. I think he had a 6 and an 8-year-old at the time. So it's probably like an under 8 league. His 8-year-old, has mental retardation, and he was like the third best player on his team. And they sign up, they go through the draft and everything and whatever, under 8s, all these teams are balanced. Then all of a sudden 7 kids come in with a coach, and they sign up as their own team, and find out that it was basically the all-star team from the previous season. And all the parents got together and decide, well, let's just wait until they've already picked the teams. Then we'll all sign up together, and they'll have to create a new team for us. And so we'll all get to play together. And so they're winning games by 40 and 50 points. So yay, they win the trophy and they win the league. But, they're 8 years old. What's the point? So you went undefeated because you stacked your teams, but who's getting better in that situation? What's it saying to the other children who just signed up, to be part of a league, have a chance to compete? What are the parents telling these children about the importance of winning and doing everything, basically breaking the rules to create this competitive advantage and so forth? Things like that happen throughout the landscape and throughout the different youth sport environments. And in a lot of respects, it goes back to this idea of, we need to be identified as talented at that early age. And study after study has shown that, generally speaking, most people who are elite at 7, 8, 9 years old, if you even want to call somebody elite at that age, don't make it, and become elite at the professional level or upper echelons of sport. But that kind of research hasn't filtered down into the lay public and the parents and, the youth coaches that are kind of making these decisions and determining the environments. And so we're still stuck on this idea that, LeBron James was amazing when he was in 9th grade. So if you're not amazing by the time you're in 9th grade, then you're never going to be amazing. And so to me, that's the biggest problem, just because it sets up so many other negatives that affect youth sport and skill development and the children involved, the parents, the coaches, etc., all the way up through, everything basically below probably professional sports is affected by those kind of early decisions and that early, just that climate that's created.
Yeah. The first point you made, I was just talking to someone about this morning, the giftedness or talent description. I'm not a big fan when we use words that really we don't need to use, right? Because often gifted or talented, we mean skilled or tall. Right. You're right. Why don't we just use those words? Saying gifted does not add any more explanatory power or any value. So it just makes this, myth perpetuate. You're right. And so I know in terms of specifics of basketball, I know you've written kind of about a plan. I believe you called Crossover, which is kind of a long-term athlete development plan. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Crossover, the new model of youth athlete development. I think that's the official title. So I wrote it back in 2005, 2004, and I kind of started out writing a different book, and then I'd come across an article by Isvan Bali from Canada talking about the long-term athlete development. And this was before LTAD plans and everything were everywhere and national governing bodies were adopting them and so on and so forth. And I just thought this was an interesting article. I didn't realize that people were actually talking about it and using it and so forth. And so I kind of adopted a lot of his framework and tried to adjust it to the American school system, because obviously, as we know, American sports being based, at least traditionally, on the school system, there are differences here that do not fit with a lot of other plans. The ideal may be that we don't reach, let's say, a competitive or elite level until, somebody's 19, 20 years old. But we know that in the States, most athletes aren't going to play beyond high school. So the end of their career is 18 years old. So does that mean, high school sports shouldn't be competitive and we should wait only until players reach college to call it really competitive sports? Or should the varsity level, be considered competitive endeavor? Because whatever it is, 97 or 99% of high school athletes aren't going to play beyond high school. So to me, I kind of adjusted it down a little bit, because I do think varsity basketball or varsity sports, they are competitive. And again, it's partially because that's going to be the end of the career for most high school athletes. So I took the framework that he had, kind of adjusted it, and wrote a book on how I think basketball players should develop over a longer period of time. To me, one of the two biggest points, one of which was Bali's points or Bali's phrase, is the peak by Friday mentality, which I kind of adopted and still use and still like the phrase and the mentality that it drives, is the idea that short-term coaching would be, focusing on your next game at all times. So I have a game on Saturday. So all my practices this week are geared towards preparing for that opponent, making sure that our plays are run perfectly in practice, making sure that we know our matchups, we know what defense we're going to play against this team, how we're going to do various things, tightening up our out of bounds plays or whatever is going to help us win this game. Whereas a long-term approach, I may do some of those things, but I'm still worried about making sure that my players individually are improving, because the goal isn't just to win this game this Saturday, but to be improving throughout the season so that we're playing our best basketball at the end of the season, so that the players that I have, especially at a junior college level, but also at a youth level, have the chance to go on and play beyond this year. Because a lot of players, and I'll speak to this when I clinics with youth coaches or youth players and so forth, is, you might have a great offense with your 8th graders, but then they're going to go to high school next year and now they're going to have a different offense. So if they only learn how to run your offense, that hasn't prepared them necessarily to play for a different coach in a different system at a different school, which they're going to do, because we know, and that's one of the differences. If you grew up in, let's say, a club in Europe, and you were going to play the same club basically from 8 years old, potentially all the way up and throughout your career into adulthood, then maybe the whole club runs the same offense, and that's fine potentially. But we know that there are certain milestones within the school system where you are definitely going to be switching teams. So if you're on an 8th grade team, you're definitely going to a new school for 9th grade. In some school districts, you're on a 9th grade team and you're switching schools, for 10th and 11th and 12th grade. And so those are changes. And so if you've only prepared to do one thing, you may not develop the skills that allow you to perform in that new environment. I know when I was, the example I use when I was young, we used to run the flex offense. So the flex offense involves a lot of screening action. As an offensive player, I'm basically getting away of my teammate's defensive player to try to get my teammate open for a shot or just in space. And so, but within the flex offense, you're running to very specific spots. And so then when I got to high school, we ran a different kind of offense that used a lot of the same type of screens, but we're at different spots. And it was like relearning a whole new, even though the skills that made up the offense were exactly the same, because they were in different spots and maybe different orders, it was like relearning something brand new. Whereas it should have been, if we had been taught screening actions first, this is how you set a screen, this is how you use a screen. Okay, now this is a flex offense, this is how we're going to use it in this specific situation. Then because we knew the general skill of screening, once we got to high school, we should have adapted much quicker because we spent so much time practicing and using screens in middle school. And so one of the things I talk about in crossover is the idea of teaching all the general skills first before we worry about specific systems and so forth. And that goes for offense and defense. Before you worry about what kind of defensive system you're going to run, players need to generally know how to stay in front of a basketball. They need to know where they should be in relation when they're not guarding the ball, where they should be in relation to the person they're guarding and the ball. And so these basic things should be taught first. And then once the basic fundamentals, if you will, are learned, then the more specifics will be learned and utilized more quickly. So that's kind of the basics. I noticed when I was coaching younger children, one of the difficulties is you want to teach everything to the players because, if you're working with a beginner, they basically don't know anything. You have to teach every single skill. They need to improve dribbling, passing, shooting, layups, defense. They don't really know the rules of the game, so they don't know when to inbound the ball and all these things. And so I think a lot of times coaches are overwhelmed when they're with these beginners or younger players. And so that was one of the things with crossover is that I was trying to say is an 8-year-old doesn't need to learn or perfect every single skill in basketball. If they can dribble the ball and make layups, that's probably good enough. Then when they're 9 years old, if they've mastered basic dribbling and layups as an 8-year-old, then as a 9-year-old, then you can add another skill. And then at 10 years old, you can add another skill as opposed to, trying to do everything all at once and not really accomplishing very much and then getting frustrated. And then because of the competitive environment, then we tend to reduce down, say, okay, well, we need to run this play and get the ball to our best player, and our best player is going to shoot every time. So those were a couple of the ideas behind the book was just acknowledging that, talent development, skill development takes time. And, there should be steps along the way, and we want to allow for that time and not try to do everything all at once, but just kind of focus on one or two things each season and help players really master those one or two things. And then as they grow, they can build on that foundation from year to year. And then also the idea, especially of it's not just about this next game this weekend or this tournament this weekend, but making sure players are progressing for the entire season to prepare them when they go on next year to play for a new coach.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So when you get to the higher levels of play, as a coach, do you revisit some of these general skills and specifically say this session is going to be about long-term development rather than the next game?
Well, I would say, for me personally, I do. I mean, we work on basic skills every single day at practice, and I do that at, virtually every level that I coach. And then, on a week-by-week basis, let's say I only had one game in a week and we were going to play on a Saturday, especially Monday and Tuesday's practice are going to be a lot more general, working on whatever skills it is that we were deficient in last week or wherever we need to improve the most. And then as we get closer to the game, maybe Thursday, Friday, that's when we're going to spend a lot more time focusing on, game preparation, and making sure that we're ready and prepared for the game that's in front of us. And I think that's one of the big differences between coaching youth and coaching, at a college level, let's say. And one of the reasons why, I hesitate and I guess argue against or warn coaches, it's not the same thing. Like just because something is done at the college level doesn't mean that it's good enough for you to use at a youth level. As a youth team might only have 2 hours of practice per week, whereas I really only use about 10 hours of practice, but I could go 15, 20 hours a week if I wanted. And that means I can do things at practice because I have time and I also have players who have fairly decent skill levels and training histories already. I can do things that shouldn't be done in a under 10 practice, because if I waste 15 minutes a week doing something, that's not a high percentage of my time. Mm-hmm. And I still have, 10 plus hours that I can do the important things. If you waste 15%, 15 minutes of your 2 hours a week, you've just wasted, 12% of the time that those players are going to spend on the court in 1 week. That's a decent amount of time that you're not going to get back. So I think youth coaches have to be even more cognizant of making sure that what they're doing is the most important things and not getting to the too specialized things that may only have an effect on, one opponent or one game or even one season. Because if you spend, a full hour preparing for the opponent on the weekend's game, that's half the time that you have to practice each week. If you do that every week, how many repetitions and how much practice are players actually getting doing things that are going to help them move beyond that season? Mm-hmm. If you're spending that much time just doing game preparation, worried about the opponents that you're facing. And some game preparation is general skills anyway. I mean, every player after, 10 or 11 years old, they should generally know how to break a press or how to play against a zone defense. So if you know that you're playing a team this weekend that runs a zone defense instead of man to man, then yeah, maybe you spend a little bit more time on zone concepts and practice. And so, you could look at that as specific game preparation, but you could also look at it, depending on how you're teaching it, as some general skill development, because players do generally need to know these things to advance in basketball. So there is a little bit of crossover between a specific game preparation and also the general skills that players need. But I think at the youth ages, everything should be geared towards those general skills. And then as players get older and better and the levels get more competitive, then, there's obviously more specific game preparation and more focus on the competitive element and, winning the games as you get to the higher college professional levels.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I know, speaking of practice, you've also written about what you call fake fundamentals. Can you tell us a bit about those? Is that something you've already described, or is that something different?
It'd probably be a little bit different. So to me, a fake fundamental is something that looks like you're training something very important, but it really has questionable value. And so one of the things, since I wrote the book, one of the things that I've kind of tried to make clear is that, just because something that I talked about as a fake fundamental in one context doesn't necessarily mean that it's always wrong. There are, maybe times that you could use it. And part of why I would consider it a fake fundamental is the reason why you're using it. So, for instance, a three-man weave is a very popular drill that basketball coaches use at every level. Basically I pass to one line, I run behind the ball, pass to the next line, and we go all the way down the court. The reason I think it's a fake fundamental is in terms of improving passing ability during games, I see very little to no transfer because passes like that are almost never made. And so it looks important and it looks like you're getting a lot of passing repetitions because you're spending 5 or 10 minutes doing nothing but passing the ball. But actually, when I was at an 8th grade practice one time watching a coach who ran three-man weaves, I counted the number of passes that players were making per minute, and it was about like 2 to 3 passes per minute once they got through all the, because there were a lot of players in the gym, and so there's a lot of, Basically there were like 3 players going at one time and like 18 players standing in line. So even though you spent 10 minutes on passing, players got like 10 to 12 repetitions in 10 minutes. So basically it was, to me, a conditioning drill. The players were just running up and down the court, and the passing was just to make it somewhat interesting for the players. And so when people tell me they use 3-man weaves as conditioning, okay, that's probably not what I would use, but yeah, you can use that depending on how you structure it. You can use it as a conditioning drill. But in terms of improving passing, I just don't see it as something that improves passing skill, because ultimately in games, we pass the ball based on, making a decision first. Who are we going to pass the ball to? In a 3-man weave drill, that's already decided for us, where, we start to our right, and then that player has to pass the ball to their left, and then that player is passing it back to the right. So there's no deciding who I'm going to pass it to. It's all, the drill tells me who I'm passing it to. In a game, I have to decide, and then I have to decide who's open. I have to account for my defensive player. I have to account for potential help defensive players, the defensive player that's guarding my teammate who I'm trying to pass to. And to me, these are the areas where most mistakes are made, beyond the absolute beginner level. It really doesn't take long for players to understand the idea of passing the ball and the most basic technique to get the ball from one person to the next. And so once you've passed that very beginning stage of understanding what a pass is, something like a 3-man weave, it doesn't account for where most mistakes are made. Most mistakes, my team made too many turnovers last night, and most of our turnovers were because we didn't account for the speed of the help defensive player, or we dribbled in too close to our own defensive player before we made that pass, and we allowed them to interrupt the pass or to get their hand on the ball. And when you're doing a 3-man weave, when there's no defense there, these constraints aren't there. And so to me, that's kind of what a fake fundamental is. It looks like we're doing a lot of passing practice, so my team committed too many turnovers last night, so we're going to go in practice tomorrow. We're going to do a lot of passing. Okay, so 3-man weaves for 10 minutes. But we're not attacking anything that caused those mistakes. So yes, it's a fundamental because there's passing involved, and that is one of our basic fundamentals of the game. But to me, it's fake because we're not actually practicing it in an environment that's going to transfer to the game that includes the constraints that lead to success and lead to errors within a game environment. And ultimately, that's why we're practicing, is to improve our game performance.
Yeah, and that really relates well to the next thing I was going to ask you about. I know one of the things you really emphasize in your training is intelligence, game intelligence, and game awareness, right? So how would you kind of spin that weave drill into something that's going to better develop the passing skills kind of in context and have this awareness?
Sure. So with the younger children especially, and even to an extent with my team, is the time that I would spend doing a drill like 3-man weave, I basically do keep away. And so, we incorporate general basketball rules, so you can't travel with the ball or you can't run with the ball and stuff like that. But keep away, while, it differs from the game, it increases our passing repetitions. And so as a general drill or a beginner drill, and again, when I went to that 8th grade practice, when the coach finished with his 3-man weaves, I asked if I could play keep away with the group. And so instead of having one court being used for 3-man weave, I had 3 games of keep away going, and I tracked in one game, and they were getting about, on average, 8 to 10 passes, I think, or maybe it was more like 6 to 8 passes per player per minute instead of, 2 to 3. So 2 to 3 times as many passes per minute, plus the passes involved making a decision and, reading defensive players. And so with younger players, you can create a bigger advantage so that they can be more successful. So the offense might have a 2 or 3 person advantage over the defense. With my group, once we get to older ages, we can actually make it so the offense has a disadvantage, so we might be playing 5 offensive players against 6 defensive players, because by adding defensive players or by reducing the space or increasing the space, we can make the drill simpler or more complex depending on the skill level of our players. And so that's how I try to design drills, is based on where I think the challenge point is for the players. So what's hard enough that they're going to improve, but in a range where they can be successful, because there's no point in doing something where it's going to be, 100 turnovers in a row. That might be hard, but they're not getting anything out of it. So I want to be in that area where they're successful enough that we're practicing skills that we can use, but there's a significant challenge there. So what Dan Coyle called the sweet spot, I believe, and I think he said the success rate should be like 60 to 80% or something like that. So I can add players or I can manipulate the spacing to kind of stay in that area where we're functioning well, but there are constraints that we have to adjust for, and we do make mistakes because there are defensive players there. We have to make decisions. There's potential for error. And so that's kind of an example of how I would structure the practice. Instead of doing, the uncontested drill, is adding in defense. And then from there, then we put it into more realistic game context. We might play 3-on-3 full. If I want to emphasize passing, play 3-on-3 full court, with no dribble, or we might do another drill, 2-on-2 or 3-on-3, where you have to complete a certain number of passes in a row before you can score. So we're adding in creating a shot after the passes, but really emphasizing passing the ball. And in those drills, we tend to play within the 3-point line. So we're really trying to reduce the space that players have to get open. So they have to work harder to create passing lanes, work harder against the player guarding them so that they can, as the passer, I can also be working to create a passing lane with ball fakes. And then my teammate who's trying to get open is trying to create a passing lane with movement. And then once we complete a certain number of passes in a row, then we're trying to do the same thing, but with the intention of scoring. And so that's one of the things that I've kind of changed over the last couple of years, is really emphasizing the intention of scoring at the end of drills. So one of the first times I was over in Europe coaching, that's how a coach described the difference between coaching in the States versus coaching in Europe. And I don't know that this is actually true, but this is what the coach said, was that in the States, we tend to do drills to do drills. And so if we're going to work on dribbling, we work on dribbling. If we're going to work on passing, we work on passing. Whereas he said in Europe, drills are designed and there's always a shot at the end of the drill. So whatever drill it is that we're working on, if we're working on passing, there's always passing with the intention to create a shot. Because ultimately in basketball, that's the purpose, is to create shots, to get a good shot, to score the basketball. So more and more, I'm trying to adjust all of my kind of general drills that focused on just one element and try to add in that, that there's that ending shot to the drill. So we do have that intention of, even if we're working on passing and we want to move the ball around, ultimately we want to move the ball around to create a shot, not just for the sake of passing.
I like that idea of keeping the whole thing together with the shot. I think you're right. It does make a difference when you have that goal at the end. I guess the last question I had for you, Brian, was kind of about your future plans. I didn't know if you had any other books you're working on or kind of any other ideas you're exploring in terms of coaching.
I have probably 3 half-written books right now on various subjects that I had intended to finish one of them this summer, but I didn't. Yeah, I'm working on 3 books that over the years people have kind of said, hey, you haven't written a book on this yet, so you need to write a book on this. So one of them's defense oriented for basketball, because I generally don't write that much about defense. One that I may or may not continue with would be more like athlete development or strength and conditioning type stuff for basketball, specific for basketball players. And then the other one would be a book for parents on how to manage this insane youth sports environment that we're in, based on my experiences over the years, both coaching, watching players, working as a trainer, dealing with parents in different avenues. And then I also referee some elite soccer, so I get to see the parents from the referee standpoint as well. And oftentimes, while serving as the assistant referee on the sidelines, listening to the conversations being had amongst parents, which is often amusing to hear what is being said, even at some of these elite tournaments with players that are undoubtedly going to become, college players, and in many cases national team type players in some of the girls tournaments that I've worked. So it's interesting to hear the conversations on the sideline and the behaviors of parents towards each other, even from the same teams and stuff like that. So kind of putting all those, kind of experiences together and then basing it, and kind of explaining the basic research that's out there that, is somewhat well publicized now with Twitter, but also not necessarily understood, or, like I tend to get emails from people when I send them a research, they'll ask me for, I got an email last week asking me for evidence for a coach who wanted to put together a presentation to argue a point to like a school board or something like that. And so I said, yeah, here's a couple of research articles that fit. And then the reply was, okay, can you just tell me in layman's terms, what are these saying? I don't have time to read 3 peer-reviewed research articles. Just give me the nuts and bolts of what's it saying. So kind of that idea in a book form for parents, kind of the parent version of my crossover book to an extent. So those are kind of the ideas that I have. Whether I actually finish all 3 of them in a timely manner remains to be seen.
No, that sounds great. I really hope you do follow through with that. I can feel your pain with lots of writing projects, but this has really been great, Brian. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. You do a great job, and I always look forward to you're one of the 2 or 3 podcasts that I look forward to every single week that give me something to think about as I'm driving from home to practice every day.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Brian. Really looking forward to those new books you mentioned. You can find out more about Brian from the links in the show notes. And remember, do check out his great site, learntocoachbasketball.com. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu, follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights, or find out more about the podcast at perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.